I think I want to begin today by having a look at what stress and resilience actually are. Now, in terms of physics, stress is the force applied to something, while strain is the consequence on the system. It's what happens. So strain is kind of what happens to the system, and stress is the force applied to that system. If we look in terms of biology, stress is anything that any external thing that disrupts the homeostatic balance. And homeostatic balance is how the whole system and all its different elements, such as blood gas levels, acid-alkaline balance, nutrients, temperature, oxygen levels, everything in the system are held in balance between both an upper and a lower limit. And those limits define our living experience. And outside of those limits, upper or lower, we get sick and we die. Now, technically then, the stress response, as we think of it now, is any psychological and physiological event, so psychological event, physiological event, or environmental event that disturbs our homeostasis, that disturbs the dynamic state between those limits, held within the parameters of well-being. But the word stress has begun to be used, and this is from Hans Selye, but it's begun to be used instead of we should use the word strain, really, but we use the word stress for the consequences of those stressors. So that's how we use the word stress. So I'm going to use it like that because that's how everyone uses it, and that's what we understand. So we think then of stress then in the way we use it as the consequence of all those stressors, whether they're environmental or psychological or emotional or physiological stuff that's happening inside the physiology of the body. And in that sense, then, stress is very much where any demand on us as a system exceeds the resources to meet it. So we don't have enough resources to meet the particular demand, and we go into a stress response. Now, the interesting thing is it's not just about whether it's actual demand, it can also be perceived demand. So if we feel, for whatever reason, and there are many, many reasons for this, there are many variables on this, okay? But if we perceive that we don't have the resources to meet the demand, a stress response occurs. And that perception could be subliminal, it could be unconscious, it doesn't have to be a really conscious decision. Do I have the resources to meet this? Most often it's an immediate, triggered, reflexive response about whether we have the resources. And of course, that depends on how we learned as children to manage stressors. Did we what did our parents teach us about how to deal with stress? How did they teach us to deal with environmental stressors, temperature, for example? How did they teach us to deal with psychological stressors? What did we learn from them? How did they teach us to deal with emotional stressors? How did they teach us to deal with physiological stressors? And if it wasn't our parents, maybe we had significant others. Maybe we were in care. What did our carers teach us? What did our schools teach us? What does our culture teach us to pay attention to and how to respond to individual stressors? So stress is where any demand on the system either exceeds the resources to meet it or is perceived at a conscious or an unconscious level to exceed the resources to meet it. And what we get then is a stress response. Now, if you meet a stressor and you feel either consciously or unconsciously or both that I've got enough resource, I can do this. You have enough resource, whether it's time, skills, energy, money, whatever's needed. If you've got enough of that, then the stressor is a challenge. These distinctions are important because they help us find our way through with regarding to managing and dealing with stress really well. So I'll say that again. If we perceive consciously or unconsciously that we have enough resources to meet that, whether it's time, energy, money, or whatever, then that stressor simply becomes a challenge. It's something we meet. But if it feels we just don't have what it takes, and again, a lot of this is learned. We learn how to do this. Yeah? If we feel we don't have what it takes, we can't deal with that situation well, then again, we go into a stress response, a cascade of responses which are psychological, emotional, and physiological that then change our perception, that change our way of being in the world, that affect us in a variety of ways. It's an important distinction because the perceived stress and the perceived resources may be quite different to what's actually available. Useful distinctions. I'm going to talk about 4 kinds of stress. The first is environmental stress. And environmental stress is things like insufficient nutrition, not enough food, not enough water. It's too hot, it's too cold. And these can be managed to a degree. I mean, people sit in ice baths, it's not a problem. But if we sat in something like -70, we wouldn't do so well. There are edges where it becomes intolerable. And, when we're working with those edges in a gentle way, and ice is, fairly manageable, -40 isn't, those yields that we benefit in what's called the response to a sublethal stressor. Something doesn't kill us. Something doesn't kill us makes us stronger, basically. And that the word for that is hormesis. And when we work on the edge of hormesis, we tend to build resilience in the system, the capacity for the system to bounce back in a good way. So working well with stressors and finding the edge of hormesis is a really good way of building in resilience into the system. And, a lot of people are doing things these days like intermittent fasting and things like this. And again, fasting can be really, really good. It's a good way of working with building resilience in the system in terms of, for example, insulin sensitivity. If we take, any of those environmental stressors, like I said, hydration, heat, nutrition, take any of them to an extreme, it's death. So there are edges, okay? The second kind of stress I want to talk about is developmental stress. And developmental stress is about childhood adversity, largely. It's about things that happen in childhood which change the way our brain grows. And one of the things that happens in childhood is with huge amounts of stress hormones in place, consistent, continuous cortisol, which is the long-term mediator of stress, the brain doesn't grow as well. The big nerves that join up the networks in the brain aren't myelinated as well. And in that loss of myelination, or that reduction in myelination in the brain, the different brain networks can't communicate effectively with each other. So we may have a strong response to a particular trigger, and it may be a strong emotional response, but our brain hasn't grown the communicative capacities then to be able to mediate that with a prefrontal cortical response, which is informed choice. And we know the outcomes of this because if we look at prison populations, we find a huge percentage, and we're talking about upwards of 60%, probably up towards 90% of the prison population are people that went through childhood adversity whose brains were riddled with cortisol as young people. And the brain doesn't have the capacity to respond to situations in the same way. Now, if somebody's hit in the head with a hammer, we would say they were brain damaged, and we wouldn't expect them to be able to make certain responses. But if we hit somebody in the head with childhood adversity as a young developing being, we expect them to take full responsibility for their choices. It doesn't make sense. But one of the outcomes of childhood adversity is this developmental stress where lots of different networks in the brain can't talk effectively, or even where the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is the hypothalamus, is the kind of core brain part that runs the whole endocrine system with all your glands. And that's the hypothalamic pituitary, which is what it communicates with in terms of the glands, and then all the way down to the adrenals, all the glands in the body. It's called the HPAA, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And that can get set up at a very early age, depending on the stress the child experiences. So these kind of developmental stressors then affect the rest of life. The effect of how we see our resources psychologically, emotionally, physiologically, environmentally. How can we handle challenge? Well, that's set up by those early years experiences. So developmental stress is really important to understand. And of course, this plays out in terms of trauma, big T trauma, capital big T, the major, big, horrible things that happen, but also the small t trauma, which is all the sort of little relentless diminishments, the put downs, the dismissals, the neglect, the somebody ignoring you the whole time, all this kind of stuff, which, and again, if we understand brain development, we understand that we are relational. We grow out of relationship. We are relationship. There's no independent, self-made man, woman, being, anywhere thing. There's no self-made person. When we understand this, we understand there's no self-made person anywhere. That doesn't exist. We are relational. We grow out of relationship. We come out of wounds. We grow in and as relationship. This is relationship. This is it. This is what we are. So this is really important, because the third kind of stress I want to think about is social and interrelational stress. And this is directly connected to early years development, of course, like we talked about with the developmental stress. But social and interrelational stress, is the patterns of emotional and narrative response to complex relational dynamics that we get into. We get into particular qualities of relationship and we respond in particular ways. We have patterns of why and where and how we're angry. How do we experience those kind of responses to situations, to relational situations? And of course, for us mammals, emotion is one of the most stressful, triggering things. Relationship is, in many ways for us mammals, the ultimate stressor. Do we belong? Are we being excluded? Are we being loved? Are we being appreciated? What's happening in terms of that relational dynamic and how that plays out? What are the kind of narratives we tell ourselves about our relationships? What's the role that we play in those narratives? Who are we when we're engaging in that? How are we responding to that? Where did we learn these patterns? Do they serve us at all? These kind of questions. Can we change those patterns to create more optimal responses? Of course, the answer to that is going to be ultimately yes, of course, right? And the fourth kind of stress I want to talk about is perceptual stress. There's really powerful recognition to understand this, because perceptual stress means we can do something about it. And perceptual stress is how we see what's happening. How do we see what is happening to us? And what can we do about it? And really, very much, this is largely where, breath work and mind training, and I think that conscious breath work is necessary. It's a necessary part of dealing with stress, but it's not sufficient. It's not enough. Breath work by itself can't do the job. So we have to have breath work and mind training, brain training, meditative depth, if you think of it that way. Meditative depth is simply going into your own brain and you working with self-applied neuroplasticity to change stuff in there, change patterns, which you can do with changing attention. So we have to learn attentional skills. We have to learn change skills to be able to change and find choice, find spaces of awareness within the synaptic patterns of our experience. And this is where breath work and mind training comes into its own. The two are part of the same puzzle. Like I said, just breath work, just doing box breathing, for example, is like applying a sticking plaster on an arterial bleed. It's not getting to the root of the problem. So box breathing is great to pull you out of the state when you're in it, for example. Box breathing is also really good, or any other kind of breathing. I'm just using box breathing example. Any other kind of breathing is a really good practice pattern to start to work with altering your states over time and learning to navigate and be in different states over time really successfully. But by itself, it's not enough. You have to have the capacity to go in and work with that self-applied neuroplasticity, which comes from mind training, from brain training. Take a breath. A lot of stress is perceptual, and perception is about where we're seeing from. Where are we looking from in this human experience? How are we seeing? What our attention is on? Yeah. That's a really important thing, because if we see a particular stressor in a particular way, consciously or unconsciously, and respond to that, we can, over time, shift that perspective. It takes time. It takes practice. It's not necessarily immediate, but it might be. I think the beauty of this recognition is that we can take responsibility for our patterns and responses then. And responsibility is what it's all about. It's about being able to see that we can make choices, regardless of what happened to us, no matter how difficult life was as a child. Sometimes it's really difficult. No matter what happens when we're a teenager, when the brain is going through big changes, lots of neuroplastic experience then under the influence of the sex hormones. No matter what happens to us as an adult, what we can do with that over time is we can learn to take responsibility for those experiences and become response able. We are able to respond rather than react and be reflexive. And of course, this is an ongoing skill. I have had enough challenges in my life to have to work with reactivity and reflexivity. I've had to do that work over and over and over and over again. And I'm not saying it's easy, but it's something we can choose and something we can do. It's a choice that becomes available to us. So I've had to do a lot of work to recover from my own childhood adverse experiences, those adversities that I went through as a child, at home, in the culture I grew up and in school as well, and in other social situations. So those kind of traumas really inform how we deal with stress. Now, these 4 kinds of stress are all interrelated. They're all interrelated. And what we're looking at is beginning to work out and understand the patterns of how do I do stress? Yeah. Another aspect, another key meta-discipline that I teach is embodied awareness. If you notice your upper trapezius muscles, these are powered by the 11th cranial nerve. If you're noticing in certain social situations that one or both of your upper trapezius muscles switches on and it kind of pulls you up like this, there's a bit of levered scapula going on there. But if you notice this muscle's happening here like this, yeah, when you're getting into a social situation, or if you're noticing some of the other muscles that are connected to the cranial nerves, the social engagement system, firing up in particular situations, it's good to be able to catch that pattern. It takes time. So the third meta-discipline I bring into here, we've talked about conscious breath work, necessary but not sufficient. Mind training, necessary but not sufficient. And then we've got embodied awareness. And the 3 give you a trinity of strategies with which you can really begin to feel into how this organism does what it does in those stress situations and how to then begin to unpick, undo, and resolve that. We'll have a look more at these meta-disciplines, just a little chat about resilience. What is resilience anyway? Well, resilience is the capacity to bend like a tree in the wind. And actually the word was first used in terms of arboriculture, working with trees. Resilience is where we ride stress, we surf stress. There's a word for good stress, and it's eustress, EU. Eustress, it comes from the Greek for good. The word is eustress. And we use the experiences to become even stronger, more committed, more playful, more creative, more curious. And we find within that experience even more of the resource or skill we need to make that demand. So we're finding in the experience the resources to meet the demand. We're not preempting that experience and considering, I don't have the resources at a conscious or unconscious level. Usually it's unconscious. We're going into that and surfing and allowing ourselves to fall off. We're meeting the demand and we're finding where our edges are and then learning to grow more skill in that. So you can see there's curiosity and there's playfulness and there's a childlike nature in that. So that resilience is learning on the job, if you like. Resilience isn't a collapse into the adrenalized reaction of a stress cascade. You might have adrenaline there. Resilience will have adrenaline going, but we have other neurotransmitters going as well. Epinephrine, one of the catecholamines in the brain, but also dopamine. We're going to be having some anticipation and reward. When we link adrenaline and dopamine together, we've got a really nice cocktail there. It's a good combination. There's other neurotransmitters we can come in. It's not just an adrenalized stress response. We've got other neurotransmitters that come in. And again, we're learning to train all this into our system with those meta-disciplines, conscious breath work, mind training, and also embodied awareness. And what we're looking at is bringing those, and really understanding what those meta-disciplines are, and bringing them into the dance, into the play of life, so that we can live more optimally. And optimal living is what we want, surely. And optimal living doesn't involve collapsing into an infinite array of stress cascades when we are unconsciously triggered based on the perceived resource availability at an unconscious level that we may have learned as young people. So we're finding the liberation from those patterns that created us that we were woven from, and we're learning to free up those patterns and create different experiences, different patterns, different ways of being. Take a breath, take a conscious breath really slowly through the nose. And breathe gently out and release, let go. Resilience is where we can anticipate the possibility of meeting the challenge. We can consider the possibility that there may be fun in this. It becomes a sport, and we give ourselves the freedom and the rewards at meeting it. It can be about goals. It can be about giving ourselves useful goals, step-by-step goals, and meeting those goals and giving ourselves that dopamine hit when we do this. It's a really beautiful game that we play then with life, of building resilience, finding resilience in this challenge. What's the next challenge? There are other things that really, really matter here. What's the quality of our relationships like? Like I said, emotional stress is one of the most demanding and one of the most crippling experiences we can have. If we go into really difficult relational situations, it can be so painful, so difficult to work with. It can take up so much of our time. So again, the mind training, where we come in and we have the capacity to be attentive to the complex emotional arrays that are running, and also then to redirect that attention onto what we choose. So mind training and breath work. Breath work is teaching us to downregulate, is teaching us to upregulate, is teaching us to resolve trauma, is teaching us to clarify a system, but ultimately it's teaching us to optimize. How do we know on the inside, without the pieces of kit that are measuring stuff? And I've got an Oura ring on here, which is measuring things as I'm talking. But how do we know that we've slept well? Do we need an Oura ring to tell us that we slept well, or do we wake up in the morning feeling amazing? Sleep is crucial with regard to stress. Getting a good night's sleep, a really, really good night's sleep. And therefore, getting a good night's sleep is dependent on us setting ourselves up for sleep before we go to bed. If our world is full of emotional drama, that makes all of that much more difficult. So trying to cultivate a relationship with emotion, our own emotions, one of emotional intelligence, and one of the emotions of other people, and the synaptic experience of that, the social engagement there, there's interrelational space. Cultivating that emotional intelligence is profoundly beneficial in terms of us managing our own stress states. It's got that relational edge. We've got sleep. We know full well that, being in a well-lived-in body, being in a body that is exercised, that moves as well as it can, that's reasonably cardiovascularly fit, that can move air in and out really well, all of that contributes to psycho-emotional well-being as well. We can't separate the body out from the psychology. Psychology is physiology. Physiology is also muscles and bones. It's mechanics. We can't separate it all out. So how we live in this physicality is how we live in this physicality. Now, of course, there are people who will say, we're not just physical bodies. We are spiritual beings having a human experience. Yep, I've heard those stories a lot. They're fascinating, aren't they? And I have a different view. If we're going to consider, because there's certain ways that the human experience tries to manage complexity. And one of the ways is meaning making. Meaning making is really, really important, as is belief, and we can talk about that a little bit as well, I suspect. Meaning making is profoundly important. What meanings do we make out of what is happening? And the meanings we make out of what is happening, of course, make perfect sense to us, the person making the meaning. They may not to other people, but they do to us. And we make meanings that help us feel safe. We make meanings that help us make sense out of complexity. And it doesn't mean the meaning is right. It just means that we've made that meaning to try and make sense out of the situation that we find ourselves in, and we go with the best possible meaning. Are meanings right? Well, arguably, no. They're way too limited. They're way too small. If we're looking at all the informational web of the whole universe, then trying to pull out some little tiny anthropocentric meaning out of that is probably a little bit limiting and limited. So we have to understand meaning making as a tool of the brain, a way the brain works, rather than meaning making being something that describes the nature of the universe. so we can relax our meaning making. And the more we can relax our meaning making and let it be creative and playful, then the more we can comfortably meet life's challenges, because we're not stuck in a meaning that we made previously that now no longer fits the current situation. So we have a flexibility of meaning making. And that's a massively useful stress management strategy. The same with beliefs. If we have certain beliefs, I'm a spiritual being I'm using that as an example, obviously. I'm having a spiritual, I'm a spiritual being having a human experience or something of that kind. That creates a delineation between the human experience and the spiritual experience. It creates two. And I'm not a great believer in a two-ness. I know full well that every lung full of oxygen, air that I take, 21% oxygen, that oxygen has been made by plants, and it goes to every single cell in my body. And therefore, whenever I look into the universe, I don't find a place where there are two things. That's a fascinating illusion. There's only one thing. It's got edges, appearance of edges, neural edges, the edges of this neural experience. We can feel those, and we define the edges. We define things in terms of edges and so forth, right? But ultimately, this cosmos is one thing, and it's all going to entropy. It's all going to go eventually. It's one thing dancing. The many is the one is the many. So for creating these distinctions between, there's this, which is separate to that, that eventually is going to create some kind of dissonance, and it's eventually going to lead to a point where we have an incapacity to make sense out of it. It's going to break. Those kind of dissonances lead to eventually to some kind of psycho-emotional collapse, because they're not tenable in the face of all the different phenomenal possibilities of the universe. They're not going to sustain very well. So the kind of beliefs and the kind of meanings we come up with, and beliefs are kind of like ossified, slightly rigid meanings that we've come up with, where we those can kick in really quickly. So again, one of the things I teach is belief artistry, being really wise with our beliefs, because belief is useful. Belief is important, and belief is really useful. I'm not knocking belief. I'm saying that with belief, we have to use it extremely well. We have to become an artist of belief, and never take them too seriously, so that we can use it. We can do incredible things with belief. We believe in what we're doing. Believe in purpose, for example. And purpose, I think of as an ongoing directional experience that we're creating in the world. And we believe in what we're doing in some way, believe in what we're giving, believe in what we're offering, believe in who we are. There's all sorts of levels of belief and aspects of belief which are extremely functional. I'm not knocking those. I'm talking about the rigidity of belief that can occur, that then makes us unable to deal with the actual demands, intricacies, complexities, and challenges of life. As a human being, you're a powerful, wonderful, learning system. Every cell in your body is consistently responding to its environment, internally and externally. That's what learning is. Every cell in your body is learning. Every part of you is in this constant learning dance with the universe. And sadly, often at school, we learn that we can't learn. One of the things I learned at school was that I wasn't a good learner. I don't believe that anymore, but I did. For many, many, many years, I believed that I wasn't very good at learning. I learned that I was a failure. Schools teach us to fail, and they teach us to feel like failures often, not always, but we're not. We're not. It's just those environments we were in weren't very good at showing us what good learners we were. That's all. And they weren't directing us in the way we, as individuals, needed to be directed. We learn best when we no longer blame ourselves or others, where we shame ourselves or others. So we no blaming and no shaming anymore. And we also, when we lose guilt as a learning experience, guilt is a short-term learning experience. Oh, damn, I wish I'd not done that. I am not going to do that again. I'm going to pay attention to this. That's a learning curve. If we get into the toxic guilt of beating ourselves with it over and over and over again, that's not necessarily very helpful. So we have to really understand these enemies of outsourcing responsibility. Outsourcing responsibility and blame makes us victims. That's going to create endless stress responses. Shaming ourselves. Shaming is where we feel bad about our existence. Now, a lot of cultures historically have shamed children. And, I've had my share of that as a young child, where I was shamed so roundly and so successfully about life energy, about making a noise, about being vibrant, about taking up too much space. We get shamed about sexuality. We get shamed in so many ways. And getting rid, when we go into a shame spiral, a shame response, it takes us into a space where we do not have the resources to meet the challenge. Our life energy itself is at fault. And that makes it very difficult to manage life. So if we're living in blame, where we're outsourcing responsibilities, blaming ourselves or others, and always feeling shame, and we're not using guilt wisely as a learning curve, but instead using it as a toxic tool to hit ourselves with, what we get from that is we get endless complexity dealing with life's challenges. We get the stress response. So what we're learning to do is we're learning to stay in a learning frame. Being able to deal with stress well means we learn to stay in a learning frame. And a learning frame is a mental and emotional state of appreciation, curiosity. Curiosity, that's interesting. How did that happen? What's happening here? So observation, appreciation, curiosity, and eventually choice and kindness. Kindness is really important. Kindness to ourselves, kindness to others. So this learning frame, which is observation, appreciation, curiosity, kindness, aiming to rest in choice in each moment as much as possible. Now, observation means we can clearly see the nature of what's happening. We can see the nature of the phenomena, whether it's thoughts, phenomena as feelings, or as body sensations, or as objects, or about people. What's actually happening in our environment? Actually understanding what is the interaction between these things, how do they interrelate, what's really occurring, and getting clearer and clearer, more clear seeing around what this array of interrelationships and interactions is like. And curiosity is a playful inquiry into how things connect and relate. How do they connect and relate? What is the relationship? I'm really curious. Appreciation, in my view, is really important. Appreciation is a precursor to kindness, but also it's a way of understanding just how amazing life is. And if we go into the situation where we understand, we're symbionts. This organism is more bacterial DNA in here than there is in the nuclear DNA, eukaryotic DNA. As a biologist, for example, I know that, a mitochondria, which people think of as the powerhouse of the cell, around about 3 billion years ago or so ago, was a separate bacteria that got eaten up or engulfed or invaded another cell, and they started to live as a symbiont. We're symbionts. We've got 10% viral DNA in here. 10% of this is viral DNA for each of us, not just this one, but all of us. It's not just this being is kind of riddled with bacteria. It's actually, that's how it is. That's how it is. We're symbionts. So staying also in appreciation of the miracle of life. All of life on this planet was dependent on photosynthesis. One green miracle. From a human perspective, it's a green miracle. From bacteria that live in volcanic vents, it's not a miracle at all. It's a bit of a frustration because it meant they couldn't live everywhere. They had to confine themselves to certain locations. But for us, complex life forms, the fact that photosynthesis happened, and by the way, photosynthesis happening released oxygen into the atmosphere, which is why you're breathing now. And that fact, and the fact that oxygen being released into the environment enabled an atmosphere around this planet to be sustained. So all the hydrogen didn't blow off into space. And if you blow hydrogen off into space, you've got no water anymore. So it would have been a desiccated rock in space if it hadn't been for the green miracle of photosynthesis. And with this conversation wouldn't be happening, and you wouldn't be breathing. So just that, the fact that you're listening to this, the fact that you're sitting here, the fact that your body's breathing, just this is worthy of appreciation and a huge amount of gratitude. If you've got food on your table, that is worthy of appreciation. If you have a roof over your head, that is worthy of appreciation. So appreciation is really important. Observation, curiosity, appreciation. Kindness. Kindness is being kind to yourself, being gentle with yourself, being tender with yourself, like you would be with a young child as you're learning. And you're still learning. This is a learning environment. This is a learning organism. We're staying in the learning frame. So all of these are approaches to working effectively with stress over time that enable us to stay well and to stay optimal. And we're learning not just to put a band-aid on the stress as it's happening, but learning how to unwrap all those patterns of how we create stress from that perceptual base so that we can unpattern all that stuff and live from a place of optimal. And that's what we're aiming for. And that's what the meta disciplines are giving us. Conscious breath work, mind training, meditative depth, embodied awareness. That's what they give. Take a breath. In through the nose. Out through the nose. Stand in through the nose. Spread the nostrils wide. Spread these little muscles here. Breathe in. Breathe out through the mouth really slowly, like you're breathing out through a straw. Again, breathe in through the nose. Spread the nostrils a little. Into your belly. Feel your belly moving best you can. Get this belly open with the breath. So that's the diaphragm pushing down. Add in a little breath on the top so it's kind of biphasic inhale, a double inhale. Momentary touch into the fullness, and then breathe out slowly through the mouth like you're breathing out through a straw. Another one, that's double inhale, just into the belly. Get this belly expanding all the way around, 360 all the way around. It's the diaphragm pushing down, front, middle, back of the diaphragm pushing down. Notice how good it feels. Staying in appreciation for this miracle of life. Staying in a learning frame. Given things as they are now, what can I do from here? What choices do I have? Where is the leverage? And it's that momentary moment of awareness in complexity where it's given things as they are now, what can I do from here? What choices do I have? Where is the leverage? And that's a rapid movement into that kind of, inquiry base from which we can then begin to mediate life, begin to work well with life in that optimal frame. And all of that comes from this learning frame. And that learning frame itself comes from the embodiment of the breath discipline, the embodiment of the mind training, the embodiment of awareness as the flesh, embodied awareness as the flesh, as the livingness of this body in movement and so forth, and in breath movement particularly. So what is this biology of stress? What actually happens? Well, the thing is with stress is that first comes a stressor. There's a phenomena of some kind that acts as a stressor, and we've talked about this already. This kind of whatever it is, maybe a thought, maybe a feeling, maybe a sensation in the body. It could be something external, environmental, but something happens. You know it if somebody makes a big noise. If somebody goes, "Wah!" and makes a big noise, you will have an adrenalized response. It's that rapid. But that phenomena acts as a stressor, and this triggers a perception of, and it's immediate and it's unconscious. Yes, I can handle this, or I'm in over my head. And those two, this happens subcortically. It happens immediately. It's connected, like I said, to trauma. It's connected to childhood adversity. It's connected to what we learned as a child. We've got all that in place, and we're undoing those patterns. But that's what happens. You don't have time to think about it. It just happens. And of course, instantly, the key brain areas of the amygdala, subcortical activity in the brain, the hypothalamus and the pituitary kick in, and they take over the stress cascade. And what happens is information is sent from those parts of the brain down to the adrenal glands. Adrenaline is squirted out into the body. And that adrenaline shifts the way the blood moves in the body. It shifts blood up to the brain. It shifts blood to the muscles away from the guts. So when we eat, it's really important to pay attention to how we and when we eat as well, and what state we're in as to how and when we eat. That blood shunting happens immediately. The eyes dilate slightly, ready to deal with any situation. Breathing rate increases slightly. Breathing can change, breathing pattern can change, but again, that's often individually learned behavior. And a lot around breathing is learned behaviors. It's not just, it happens automatically. It's not like that. So some individuals may go into mouth breathing and hyperventilate a little bit, which then reduces carbon dioxide in the blood, which then creates more problems because we have less oxygen going to the brain. Some people go into apical breathing up here. Yeah. Different patterns. And again, that's a less than optimal breathing style if you're not super active. And even then, it's questionable. So the stress cascade consists of stimulus, perception, neuroendocrine activation, physiology, and then ultimately behavior. And the behaviors we come up with, the stress behaviors, are one of three kinds in their base form. And one is moving towards something. It's moving outwards, whether it's going for something or whether it's an aggressive response to something, an attack. It's going towards something we want, or it can head towards, but it's an outward energy movement. So one of the responses is an outward energy movement. Another response is a walling that can happen, a shutdown of indifference. We close down. I've seen this a lot. City life, modern city life tends to do this to people. They kind of shut down, lock in. And it creates a certain muscular armoring, maybe a shutting in the front line of the body, a slight tightening. Yeah, a tightening around the jaw and the face, but you can see a tighter pattern happening. And that's kind of like it doesn't matter. It doesn't bother me. It's none of my business kind of response. It's this indifference. And the third one is a withdrawal, a pulling away. And that third energy is kind of like a reflexive pulling away. And that goes all the way to a running away. Yeah, and ultimately to a freeze. So we get these responses in the system, and these have been identified in different ways. Some people go into fight, which is that outward energy. Some people go into fright, which is an immediate kind of, before you actually then make a response, which might be any one of those three types of energetic movement: outwards, walling, or pulling away. So fight, flight. Flight is another one, the running away we talked about. Yeah, but we've also got freeze. We talked about that, so it can be a walling, an instantaneous defensive walling, but it can also be a freeze, like the rabbit in the headlights type feeling. And it could be flop. Ultimately, it can go into flop. And again, we could talk about, Stephen Porges' polyvagal model in relationship to this, but I'm not going to go there just today. I want to just keep this relatively simple today. So, the flop where we collapse into something. Oh, can't do this anymore. Now, I know all those places, and I'm sure you know all those places. So again, with regard to optimizing, with regard to stress, we're getting familiar with those places in us. Fight, fright, flight, freeze, fawn, which is fawn, I didn't mention, by the way. Fawn is where you kind of make friends with an aggressor. Yeah. So we've got all those places in us, and we get familiar with those energies of movement, and we can catch those again and make choices. What is the choices? What choice do I have here? What other choice do I have available to me? Because that starts to undo the patterns. It starts to work with the self-applied neuroplasticity, where we're undoing the pattern of how we have been made by circumstances, relational situations, and our own choices in that, and then finding more choice to change the pattern and do something differently. We have to catch those triggers. And the work of the meta disciplines is then to catch those triggers and to be able to find that choice. So really the work of discipline is to find awareness. The work of discipline is to find awareness. And if we're working with stress, then that's what we need ultimately, is not just to do a little bit of box breath to handle the difficult situation, but actually to ultimately undo the pattern at its core and choose over time a more optimal life. And for that, conscious breath work is absolutely necessary. It teaches us to down-regulate, to up-regulate, to optimize any patterns. And again, I'll talk about this on another podcast. I'll talk about the evolution of breath and the evolution of why we do certain kinds of pattern. But right now, just to say that, we're undoing the learned behaviors, the patterns of how we suboptimally breathe in complex situations, and learning how to optimize that. And that requires awareness. So one of the things, the breath, systematic, deep, I'm not talking here conscious breath. I'm not talking about, getting into a hypercapnic state very rapidly to deoxygenate your brain and see what happens. And there's value in doing that to a degree. I'm talking about a deeper, more systematic approach to conscious breath work, which teaches us a high level of awareness of psychophysiological, somatic responsivity and awareness in all those complex strands and interweaves, along with the brain training, the mind training, along with the embodied awareness. And those meta disciplines give us the edge in terms of working successfully, effectively with re-optimizing our whole system in relationship to the world, whatever our starting point is. And I can assure you, I've had to do the work, and I still have to do it. Right? That's the way of things when we're really, really open to awareness, when we're really open in a learning frame. The learning frame ideally goes on to the point when we die. This is wonderful. This is all an amazing, wonderful opportunity to be able to dive deep into the nature of life, and working with stress and stressors is a key aspect, because the stress represents the edges of our experience internally, psychologically, emotionally, physically, and also relationally into the world. All of that is the edges of our experience, and that is the learning edge that we want to be in. We're learning to live on the edge and to learn to be comfortable in the edge, and learning to surf the edges of our experience in a good way. So that's a little bit of a conversation about stress, and I'm going to continue this next time by talking more about stress and breath and trauma. But thank you for tuning in. I've thoroughly enjoyed sharing some of this, so thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.